He pushed open the gate to the Rourke property like he owned it already. Because in his mind, he did. 3 men rode in behind him, big men with nothing soft in their faces, and Crow himself stepped down from his horse slow and deliberate, the way a man steps onto something that already belongs to him. Elias Rourke was working the fence line when he heard the horses. He straightened up, hammer still in hand, and watched Crow cross the yard toward him without being invited. "You look tired, Rourke," Crow said. He didn't offer a hand. He looked around the property the way a buyer looks at damaged goods, measuring, calculating, already deciding what he'd tear down first. "This place is wearing you out." Elias didn't answer. Crow reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He held it out. Elias didn't move to take it. "That's my offer," Crow said. Final one. You've got 3 days." "I've got nothing for you," Elias said. Crow smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind a man wears when he knows something you don't. "You've got 6 children, Rourke, and a ranch that's bleeding out." He glanced toward the house, toward the window where, though neither man knew it, 8-year-old Noah was standing with his face pressed against the glass, watching. A man in your position ought to think about what's practical. He dropped the paper on the fence post and walked back to his horse. 3 days, he said again, without turning around. He rode out the same way he came in, like he owned every inch of ground his horse touched. If you've ever had someone look at your life like it was already theirs to take, if you've ever stood holding everything you had left while someone told you it wasn't enough, then you already know how Elias Rourke felt that afternoon. And you already know the kind of woman this story needs. Before we go further, if stories like this one find something real in you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Drop a comment and tell us what city or country you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Mara Bennett arrived in Iron Hollow Valley on a Tuesday, which she would later say was appropriate because nothing good or bad ever seemed to happen on a Tuesday. It just happened. No ceremony, no warning. You woke up and the day was already moving without you. She stepped off the supply wagon with one suitcase that had a broken latch she'd been holding shut with a strip of leather since Kansas City, and she stood in the middle of a dirt road and looked at what the valley had to offer. It wasn't much. A feed store, a post office the size of a broom closet, a church with a crooked steeple, a saloon that opened before noon and probably never fully closed, 3 or 4 structures that couldn't decide if they were houses or piles of lumber in the process of becoming houses. She'd seen worse, not much worse, but some. The man who'd placed the advertisement in the Missouri paper had described the position as housekeeper and cook for a working ranch, children present, room and board provided. He had not described the children. He had not described himself. He had not described what the word working meant when applied to a ranch that appeared, from the road, to be actively falling apart. She'd written back anyway. She didn't have the luxury of being particular. Her name was Mara Bennett, she was 29 years old, and she had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband Thomas had died of a fever that moved through their small farm in Missouri like a debt collector, fast, indifferent, leaving nothing behind. The farm had gone to Thomas's brother, who was within his legal rights and exercised them without apology. The savings had gone to the doctor, and then the funeral, and then 2 months of lodging while Mara figured out what came next. What came next was this: Iron Hollow Valley. A job she knew almost nothing about, a man she'd never met, and 6 children she'd been warned were a handful, which in her experience meant something between difficult and ungovernable. She picked up her suitcase and held the latch shut with her thumb and walked toward the ranch. The Rourke property sat a mile outside of town at the end of a road that hadn't been properly graded in years. She could see the house from the bend, a 2-story structure that had once been painted white and was now the color of old bone. The porch railing on the left side had come loose from its post and leaned outward at an angle that was either charming or dangerous depending on your disposition. The yard between the road and the front door was all hard-packed dirt with a few patches of dry grass that had given up. She was 50 yards from the front door when it opened, and a girl came out and stood on the porch with her arms crossed. 13 years old, maybe. Dark hair pulled back from a face that was watching Mara with the flat, measuring expression of someone who has been disappointed enough times to stop being surprised by it. "You're the new housekeeper," the girl said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Mara said. "Mara Bennett." We've had 3 others, the girl said. 2 left before the month was out. One stayed 6 weeks and then said she had family needing her in Denver. Mara stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Did she have family in Denver? I don't know, maybe. The girl's expression didn't shift. Probably she just left. What's your name? Elsie. How old are you, Elsie? 13. And you're the one who answers the door. Someone has to. Elsie looked at the suitcase. Is that all you brought? It is. Elsie considered that for a moment, then stepped aside and let her in. The inside of the house was better than the outside suggested and worse than it should have been. The kitchen was large and had a good stove, which Mara noticed first because she was a practical woman, and the stove told you more about a household than almost anything else. But the dishes in the basin had been sitting long enough to need real scrubbing. The floor hadn't been swept in at least a week, and the smell of the place was the particular smell of a house where nobody was managing the small things anymore. She found the source of the noise before she found the children. It was coming from above, something rhythmic and percussive, like boots on a wooden floor. Then 2 small figures came barreling down the stairs so fast they nearly knocked into each other at the bottom landing, caught themselves, and stood looking at Mara with identical faces and identical expressions of uncomplicated curiosity. Twins, girls, 9 years old, she'd guess, with their mother's coloring if their mother had dark eyes, and the kind of energy that made rooms feel smaller. I'm May, said the one on the left. I'm June, said the one on the right. Are you staying? May asked. I intend to, Mara said. The last one cried, June said helpfully. On her 3rd day. In the pantry. We weren't supposed to know, but we heard her. June, Elsie said. June looked only slightly apologetic. I'm just saying. Mara set her suitcase down beside the kitchen table. Where's your father? Out back, Elsie said. He's been trying to fix the fence by the south pasture since morning. And the others? Caleb's in the barn. Noah's probably drawing somewhere. And Toby? Elsie stopped. Her expression shifted for just a moment into something that wasn't flat or guarded, something younger and less controlled. Toby's upstairs. Is he all right? He doesn't talk much, May said. Since Mama. Nobody elaborated on that. Nobody needed to. Mara hung her coat on the hook by the door and found an apron on the peg beside it and put it on. Elsie watched her with the careful attention of someone waiting to be proved right about something. What are you doing? Elsie asked. There are dishes that need doing, Mara said. And it's past noon, and I'm guessing nobody's eaten lunch. We had biscuits this morning. That was this morning. Mara rolled up her sleeves. What's in the pantry? Elsie took her to the pantry. It wasn't empty, but it wasn't well organized either. The kind of pantry that comes from a man buying provisions without a clear plan, grabbing what he remembered and forgetting what was already there. Mara looked at it for 30 seconds and started building a mental inventory. Sit down, she told Elsie. Talk to me while I work. I work better when there's someone to talk to. Elsie sat. She didn't look like she wanted to, but she sat. For the next hour, Mara cooked. Soup, because soup was what you made when you wanted a kitchen to smell like home again, and because soup forgave almost any combination of ingredients if you knew what you were doing with them. She got Elsie talking, not about the big things, not yet, but about the small ones. The twins' habit of finishing each other's sentences. Caleb's silences. Noah's drawings, which Elsie described with a sideways kind of pride she seemed embarrassed by. The horse in the barn named Murphy, who had strong opinions about strangers. She did not ask about the children's mother. She did not ask about the previous housekeepers. She let Elsie decide what to tell her and what to keep. Elias Rourke came through the back door at 1:30 with dirt on his hands and the look of a man who had been fighting something all morning and hadn't won. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than his frame suggested from a distance, and he had the kind of face that had been weathered into something that probably looked older than it was. He stopped when he saw Mara at the stove. You made it, he said. I did. He looked at the soup, then at his daughter, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of water, and what might have been the beginning of a relaxed expression if you were watching closely enough to catch it. Elias Rourke, he said. Mara Bennett. She didn't offer her hand because her hands were busy. Sit down. It'll be ready in 10 minutes. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not unfriendly, not warm, just careful. The way a man looks at something he's been burned by before and doesn't know yet whether to trust. He sat down. The children arrived in stages. May and June appeared as though conjured by the smell of food. Caleb came in from the barn, 11 years old, with his father's coloring and a stillness about him that didn't belong to a boy his age. He sat at the table without speaking. Noah materialized from somewhere on the second floor, a smear of charcoal on his left hand, and took the chair nearest the window. Toby was the last. He was 4 years old and very small for it, with a wooden horse clutched against his chest so tightly it seemed like he'd forgotten it was there, like it had become part of his hand. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Mara with eyes that were enormous and serious. He didn't come in. Mara looked at him from across the room. She didn't smile too wide. She'd learned that children who'd been through things didn't trust the smiles that tried too hard. She just looked at him, the same way she'd look at anyone she was meeting for the first time. "Is that your horse?" she asked. He looked down at Buck, then back at her. He didn't answer. "He's got good ears," Mara said, and turned back to the stove. After a moment, Toby crossed the kitchen and sat in the empty chair between May and the wall. She didn't make anything of it. She just put the bowls on the table and sat down herself, and the Rourke family ate their first meal with Mara Bennett in something close to quiet. And the quiet was not the bad kind. It was the kind that happens when people are too hungry and too tired to fight for a few minutes, and sometimes that's the closest thing to peace you get. Elias ate 2 bowls. He didn't comment on the food, but when he pushed back from the table, he said, "Your room's the one at the end of the hall, past the linen cupboard. Elsie can show you." "I'll find it," Mara said. He nodded once and went back outside. That evening, after the dishes were done and the twins had been sent upstairs with varying degrees of protest, after Caleb had retreated to the barn and Noah to his room and Toby had fallen asleep in the chair by the window with Buck still clutched to his chest, Mara carried him up the stairs and laid him in his bed and pulled the blanket over him and didn't try to take the horse. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at him. 4 years old, barely speaking, carrying a grief that was too big for a body that small. She went to her room at the end of the hall, opened her broken suitcase, and sat on the edge of the bed. Through the window she could see the barn, and the fence beyond it, and the dark shape of the mountains against the last of the evening light. She had $14 and some change in the bottom of that suitcase. She had a job that 3 other women had already walked away from. She had 6 children who ranged from openly hostile to silently shattered, and a man who spoke in sentences of 5 words or fewer and seemed to regard every person in his vicinity as a potential disappointment. She wasn't afraid exactly. She'd used up most of her fear in Missouri, in the months after Thomas died, when the real face of how alone a woman could be in this country had become unavoidable. What she felt now was something simpler, something that was almost, not hope, that was too fragile a word, but the particular steadiness of a person who has decided to stop waiting for the right circumstances and just begin. She unfolded the blanket at the foot of the bed. She lay down without changing her clothes. Tomorrow she would take an inventory of what the pantry actually needed. She would look at the state of the back garden and see what could be salvaged. She would figure out what Caleb needed and whether Toby's silence was the kind that was waiting to break open or the kind that had gone somewhere deeper. She would figure out Elias Rourke, who looked at his own children like a man standing on the far bank of a river, watching them but unable to cross. She would stay. That was the decision she'd already made, and she wasn't the kind of woman who unmade decisions. The ranch was broken. The family inside it was more broken still. But Mara Bennett had rebuilt things before, and she was not, as it turned out, done. 3 weeks into her time at the Rourke Ranch, Mara discovered that the household ran on a system of avoidances, so finely tuned it had become invisible to everyone inside it. Elias avoided the kitchen in the mornings because that was when his wife had made coffee, and the smell of it still did something to him he didn't know how to manage. Caleb avoided the dinner table on Sundays because Sunday had been the day his mother read aloud after supper. Noah avoided his mother's rocking chair in the front room, which sat exactly where she'd left it with a folded quilt over the arm. And nobody had moved it, and nobody would, and everyone stepped around it like it was a piece of furniture in a room that no longer existed. The twins avoided talking about their mother directly, but talked around her constantly. May would say, "We used to," and June would finish, "Have pie on Fridays." and then they'd both go quiet for exactly 3 seconds before moving on to something else, like they'd practiced the grief until it fit into a manageable shape. And Toby avoided speaking. Not entirely. He'd said a few words since Mara arrived. Buck. No. Mine. Once, when June had tried to take the wooden horse as a joke, he'd said, "Give it back," with a ferocity that stopped the room cold and made June hand it over without another word. But the full sentences, the easy back and forth of a 4-year-old who hadn't learned yet that the world was something to be careful with, that was gone. Mara had worked around enough grief to know you couldn't pull a child out of silence. You had to make the silence comfortable enough that they eventually chose to leave it on their own. She was learning all of this the same way she learned everything, by watching, by not asking more than she needed to, and by being the kind of present that didn't demand anything in return. What she was also learning, more slowly, was that the Rourke Ranch's problems were not only about grief. The first sign was the fence. Elias had spent the better part of 2 days repairing the section along the south pasture, and on the third morning he came to breakfast with a set to his jaw that meant something had gone wrong again. He didn't say anything at the table. He ate fast and went back out. Mara watched him from the kitchen window and saw him standing at the fence line with his hands on his hips, staring at something she couldn't make out from that distance. She went out after breakfast. The fence post she'd watched him sink 3 days ago had been pulled up. Not by wind, not by cattle pushing through. Pulled up deliberately. The earth around the bases was disturbed in a specific way, like someone had dug them loose and then replaced the dirt to make it look less obvious. One of them had been snapped clean in half. The wire had been cut at 2 points. "When did this happen?" she asked. Elias looked at her like he was deciding whether to answer. He was like that. He had to make the decision to speak each time, like conversation didn't come naturally, but was a choice he made deliberately and sometimes reconsidered halfway through. "Sometime last night," he said. "Has this happened before?" A pause. "3 times in the past 2 months. Mara looked at the cut wire. Clean cut. Someone had brought tools. "You think it's random?" He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She didn't push. She went back to the house and spent the morning turning the information over in her mind, the way she turned bread dough. Methodically, pressing at it until she understood its shape. The answer came to her 4 days later, when she went into town for supplies and ran into Clara Holt at the feed store. Clara Holt was the wife of Warren Holt, who ran the small cattle operation 2 miles east of the Rourke property. She was a woman of about 50, with a practical face and tired eyes, and the particular manner of someone who'd been carrying worry long enough that it had become her default expression. She and Mara had exchanged pleasantries twice before, without getting past the surface of either of their lives. This time, Clara looked at Mara's list of supplies, and then at Mara herself, and something passed across her face. A decision being made. "You're at the Rourke place," Clara said. "I am." "How is he holding up?" "He's managing," Mara said carefully. "Mostly." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, in a lower voice, "Has he had any more trouble? With the fences?" Mara went still. "He mentioned it." Clara set down the bag of oats she'd been holding. "It's not just him," she said. "Warren lost 11 head of cattle last month, just gone. And the Pearson family on the North Ridge, someone broke their irrigation line 2 weeks ago, cost them the better part of the summer water." She paused. "The Delacroix boy, young Henri, he found his barn door nailed shut from the outside with the horses still inside. In July. If he hadn't smelled the heat..." She stopped herself. "These things don't happen one at a time, not like this." Mara thought about the cut wire, the pulled fence posts, the deliberate, methodical quality of it. "Crow," she said. Clara didn't look surprised that she knew the name. In a valley this size, Silas Crow was not a man you needed to be introduced to. You heard his name in the way you heard about weather, inevitably, and usually before it arrived. "He's been making offers," Claire said. "To everyone. Warren's gotten 2. Said no both times." She looked at her hands. "The second time he said no, our well went dry the next week. Not naturally dry. Someone blocked the runoff channel upstream." "Did you report it?" Clara looked at her with an expression that said she understood what Mara was and wasn't yet understanding about Iron Hollow Valley. "To who?" she said. "The county assessor is Bill Tanner, and Bill Tanner has been seen having supper at Crow's house twice in the last month. The sheriff's a decent enough man, but he needs evidence to act on, and Crow never leaves evidence. He leaves things that could be coincidence, if you're inclined to believe in coincidence. Mara rode back to the ranch with her supplies and this new information sitting heavy in the wagon alongside the flour and salt pork. She found Elias splitting wood behind the barn and stood where he could see her and waited for him to stop. He kept splitting for a full minute before he did. He had a particular stubbornness about him that she'd come to recognize. He finished what he was doing before he dealt with anything else, and she had started to understand that this wasn't rudeness. It was the only kind of control he had left over his own days. "I talked to Clara Holt," she said when he finally stopped. He set the axe down. He already knew what was coming. She could see it in how he held himself, the careful stillness of a man who has been bracing for something for so long. The bracing has become his natural posture. "How many offers has Crow made you?" she asked. Elias looked at the woodpile. 4. "And the fence, the cattle you lost in March, the equipment that went missing in May." He looked at her sharply. She hadn't known about the equipment. He hadn't told her. "Elsie talks," Mara said simply. It wasn't an accusation. It was just fact. He picked up the axe again and set another piece of wood on the block, and then he didn't swing it. He just stood there with it in his hands. "There's nothing to be done about it," he said. "I can't prove anything." "Not alone, you can't." He set the axe against the block. "What does that mean?" "It means the Holts have had their well tampered with, and the Pearsons lost their irrigation, and the Delacroix boy nearly lost his horses in a locked barn in July." She watched his face. "Crow isn't just after your land, Elias. He's after all of it, and the way he's doing it, he's keeping everyone separate, everyone fighting their own fires alone. That's not an accident, that's strategy." Elias was quiet for a long time. The late afternoon light was doing something complicated to the yard, stretching the shadows long, and somewhere beyond the fence the horses were moving. She could hear them. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying one rancher making a complaint about cut wire goes nowhere," Mara said. "But 4 ranchers with documented losses and a pattern, that's something different. That's something a judge can look at." "Crow has influence with the county." "He has influence with Tanner," Mara said. "But Tanner isn't the only official in the county, and he won't be assessor forever. Crow's scheme only works if nobody sees it as a scheme, if it stays a collection of unfortunate coincidences." She paused. "You start writing things down, dates, what happened, any witnesses, and you get the others to do the same, and suddenly it's not a coincidence anymore. It's a record." Elias looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful measuring look he gave her most of the time, and not the flat exhaustion that had settled over his face like weather. This was something more complicated, like a man who had been told something he already half knew but had stopped letting himself think. "You figured all this out from a conversation with Clara Holt," he said. "Clara Holt is a smart woman who's been watching this happen for a year," Mara said. "She's figured it out too. She just needed someone to say it out loud." He picked up the axe again. He split 2 more pieces of wood. Then he said, without looking at her, "I'll think about it." Which, she was learning, was as close to yes as Elias Rourke generally got on the first try. She went back inside and started supper. The days that followed had a different quality to them. Elias began writing things down. She saw the ledger on his desk one morning when she was putting fresh linens in the hall, his handwriting neat and deliberate, dates and descriptions. She didn't comment on it. She let him think it was his idea, which in some ways it was. And she began quietly to extend the kitchen outward. It started with Clara Holt, who came by with eggs one afternoon and stayed for coffee, and then stayed for an hour. Then Warren Holt came with her the following week, and he and Elias sat at the kitchen table and talked about losses in the way men talk about things they'd rather not talk about, sideways, in incomplete sentences, needing to circle something 3 times before they'd land on it directly. Mara kept coffee coming and didn't insert herself into the conversation, which was its own kind of contribution. Then the Pearson family. Then old Henri Delacroix and his son, who drove over from the North Ridge with a jug of cider and a list of dates they'd written on the back of a seed catalog. The kitchen, which had been a room for feeding 6 people, became something else. A room where people sat down in their fear and their anger and their stubbornness and found out that the person across the table was carrying the same weight. Crow, it turned out, had made offers to all of them. All had refused. All had experienced, in the weeks following their refusals, a particular kind of bad luck that wasn't luck at all. What Mara was building, without calling it anything, was an alliance, and it was growing. Elias noticed. He noticed the way he noticed most things, without saying much, but with that quality of attention he had, the kind that didn't miss details even when he pretended it did. One evening after the Pearsons had gone, he stood in the kitchen doorway while Mara washed the cups. "You did that on purpose," he said. "Did what?" "Brought them all here. Made it so it wasn't a meeting, it was just people stopping by." Mara set a cup on the drying rack. "Men don't like meetings," she said. "They like stopping by. The conversation's the same either way." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, not a full one, but close. It was the first time she'd heard anything close to it from him. She didn't make anything of it, and he went back to his desk, and she thought about how that small, almost laugh had sat in the room, like something she hadn't expected to find. The children were changing too, in their slow and uneven way. May and June had started helping in the kitchen, not because Mara had asked them to, but because they'd started appearing at her elbow with the instinct children have for where the warmth is. June turned out to have a genuine feel for baking, her small hands working dough with a seriousness that was completely at odds with her usual chaos. May had no interest in cooking, but was an excellent organizer, and had taken it upon herself to rearrange the pantry into a system that made actual sense, which Mara praised so sincerely that May had stood up a little straighter. Noah still kept to himself mostly, but he had started leaving his drawings in places where Mara would find them. Not giving them to her, leaving them. On the kitchen table, folded on the windowsill, once tucked under the edge of her coffee cup. They were drawings of the ranch mostly, the barn, the fence line, Murphy the horse, with his strong opinions. She noticed that more recently, the drawings had started to include a figure she recognized from the height and the apron as herself. She didn't mention it to him. She just put them in the drawer beside her bed and kept finding them. Caleb was harder. 11-year-old boys in pain have a particular quality of absence. They're present in the room but somewhere else entirely, standing just outside the conversation, not allowing themselves to be reached. I was polite to Mara in a careful, distant way, as though courtesy were a wall he'd built that he could maintain without committing to anything behind it. The afternoon she made a dent in that wall, she hadn't planned it. She was in the barn, because Murphy had been off his feed, and she'd gone out to see whether it was something simple, and she found Caleb already there, sitting against the stall door with his knees drawn up, talking to the horse. Not about anything particular, the low, rambling kind of talk that's really just about not being alone. She didn't pretend she hadn't heard. She sat down on the bench near the barn door, far enough away to not crowd him, and started cleaning the spare bridle that had been needing attention for 2 weeks. Caleb went quiet. "You don't have to stop," Mara said. "He's a good listener." A pause. "He's a horse," Caleb said. "Sometimes that's better." She worked at a tangle in the leather. "He doesn't try to fix anything or tell you how you should be feeling." Caleb said nothing, but he didn't leave. After a while he said, "Dad doesn't talk about her." Mara kept working the bridle. "No," she said. "I don't think he knows how." "Probably not." "Does it get better?" Caleb asked. He asked it the way an 11-year-old asks questions that scare them. Fast, looking sideways, as though they might take it back if the answer is wrong. Mara thought about Thomas, about the particular shape of the months after, when she'd kept reaching for him in small ways. Turning to say something and finding empty space, starting a thought with "we" and catching herself. "It changes," she said. "It doesn't get smaller, exactly, but you grow around it. It takes up the same space, but you get bigger, so it's not all of you anymore." She paused. "That's the best I can tell you. It's not much." "It's okay," Caleb said. He was quiet for another minute. Then, "Murphy likes apples, but he gets gassy, and Dad says we shouldn't give him too many, but Elsie does anyway." "I'll keep that in mind," Mara said. He almost smiled. It came and went like a flash of light through clouds, but she saw it. That was what passed for breakthrough in a house like this one, and she took it for what it was. Toby remained the one she couldn't reach, not fully. He watched her with those enormous, serious eyes, and he followed her sometimes. She'd turn around and find him 3 feet behind her, just present, just watching. And he'd let her cut his food and once allowed her to retie his bootlace without pulling away, which was more than he'd allowed the previous housekeeper to do even once, according to Elsie. But he didn't talk to her. He talked to Buck. He talked to the chickens. He occasionally murmured something to Noah when they were together on the porch in the evenings. He did not talk to Mara. She was patient. She had learned patience the way most people learn it, by running out of everything else first. It was the first week of August when the threatening message appeared at the gate. Elias found it when he went out for the early feeding. A paper rolled and tied with a cord, pushed through the gap in the gate post. The handwriting on it was deliberate, clean, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who wants you to understand they're educated, that this isn't from someone beneath you. He brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table without saying anything, and Mara read it while Elias poured his coffee. It said in essence that the final offer was being withdrawn, that the property would be reassessed for county tax purposes by the end of the month, that a man in Rourke's financial position might want to consider his situation carefully before that assessment was complete. The threat was made with complete plausible deniability. There was no signature. There was no specific threat. There was only the polite, careful language of someone who knows how to break a person without leaving marks. Elias read it again after she handed it back to him. His jaw was set in a way that she recognized by now, the prelude to a decision made in anger, the kind that felt right for about 20 minutes and then made everything worse. "I'm going to ride to Crow's property today," he said. "No," Mara said. He looked at her. "That's what this is designed to make you do," she said. "You show up at his door angry, and he calls it a threat, and suddenly you're the problem. He's been waiting for you to do something he can use." She picked up the paper. "This is a document. This goes with the ledger." "The ledger isn't doing anything." "It's not doing anything yet." She set the paper down. "Elias, what did you do the last time one of your fences was cut?" He paused. "Fixed it." "And the time before?" "Fixed it." "Right, and Crow knows that. He knows you're going to absorb it and keep going alone because that's what you've been doing your whole life. The moment you stop absorbing it alone, the moment it becomes 10 ranchers with dated records and a pattern that goes in front of someone who isn't Bill Tanner, his strategy falls apart." She looked at him steadily. "He's not more powerful than all of you. He's more powerful than each of you separately. That's a different thing." Elias looked at her for a long time. Outside, May and June were arguing about something in the yard, their voices carrying the specific pitch of twins who are actually enjoying the argument. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window and doing that thing it did in late summer, falling low and warm across the table. "You think a group of struggling ranchers writing in ledgers is going to stop Silas Crow," he said. "Not quite a question." "I think Silas Crow has been counting on nobody trying," Mara said, "and I think he was right, until now." Elias set down his coffee cup. He looked at the paper one more time. "I'll talk to Warren Holt today," he said. "Good. And Henri Delacroix." "Good." He got up and got his hat and stopped at the door. He looked back at her with an expression she was getting to know slowly, piece by piece, like a map of a place she hadn't visited yet. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "This isn't your fight. You could find another position, somewhere without all this." Mara considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. "Because it matters," she said, "and because someone should." He put on his hat and went out. Through the window, she watched him cross the yard toward the barn, and she thought about Crow's paper on the table, and the ranchers who were going to come to her kitchen again this week with their records and their anger and their stubborn determination to keep what was theirs. She thought about Elsie, who had started calling her by her first name instead of the housekeeper, about Noah's drawings in her bedside drawer, about Caleb's almost smile in the barn, about Toby's enormous serious eyes following her across the kitchen. She thought about Elias Rourke, who had asked her why she was doing this, as though the answer was genuinely unclear to him. As though he'd been alone so long he'd forgotten that people sometimes stayed. She poured herself the last of the coffee and stood at the window and let herself feel, for just a moment, the particular weight of a place that was starting to feel less like a job and more like something she didn't have a clean word for yet. Then the twins started yelling again, louder, and Toby appeared in the kitchen doorway with his eyes wide and Buck pressed to his chest, and Mara set down her cup and went to deal with whatever was happening in the yard. That was the job. And she was, as it turned out, still here. Across the valley, in a house that had real curtains in the windows and a man paid to tend the grounds, Silas Crow was reading a letter from his man in town who kept an ear on things. The letter said that the widow woman at the Rourke place had been seen talking to Clara Holt at the feed store, that the Holts and the Pearsons and old Delacroix had all been to the Rourke kitchen in the past 2 weeks, that there seemed to be some kind of organizing happening. Crow folded the letter carefully along its original crease and set it on his desk. He sat for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. He'd broken ranchers before. He'd broken men who were tougher than Elias Rourke and more stubborn and had more to fight with. It took patience, and it took the right kind of pressure applied to the right place, and it took keeping people from realizing they weren't alone. He'd been good at that last part. He was less certain now that he still had it under control. He picked up his pen and began writing a reply. Whatever was happening at the Rourke Ranch needed to stop. Not later. Now. And Silas Crow had not come this far by being slow about things that needed handling. Crow's letter reached his man in town on a Thursday, and by Friday the valley knew something had shifted, the way valleys always know. Not from anything said directly, but from the quality of the silence between things. Elias felt it when he rode into town for lumber that morning. The man at the hardware store was friendlier than usual in a way that felt rehearsed. 2 men he recognized as working Crow's outer property were standing outside the saloon at 9 in the morning, not drinking, just standing, watching the street with the particular idleness of men who are being paid to be somewhere without being told exactly why. He bought his lumber and rode back without stopping to talk to anyone, and when he got home he told Mara what he'd seen. She was rolling out pastry dough at the kitchen table, flour on her hands, and a crease between her brows that meant she was already thinking about something. She listened to him without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd come to notice about her. She didn't jump into the middle of what you were saying to offer the part she already knew. "He knows we've been meeting," she said when he finished. "Looks that way." She pressed the rolling pin down and worked it outward. "Then we stop pretending it's casual," she said. "If he already knows, there's no point in being careful about it. We call a proper meeting, everyone, together, at the same time." Elias pulled out a chair and sat down. "You think that's wise, making it obvious?" "I think obvious is the only thing left," she said. "The moment 10 ranchers are sitting in the same room with a shared set of documents, it's not a rumor anymore. It's something with weight." She looked up at him. "Crow's been able to pick everyone off one at a time because nobody's made a formation. It's time to make one." He looked at the flour on her hands, at the domestic ordinariness of the moment sitting up against the thing they were actually talking about, and he thought that there was something almost disorienting about this woman, the way she moved between these 2 registers without any visible seam, soup on the stove and land strategy at the same table, and no sign that she found either one more important than the other. "I'll send word to the Holts today," he said, "and the Delacroix, and Pearson, and Ruth Connolly. Her husband may be gone, but she knows what's been happening on her land, and she's got records going back further than any of us." Mara paused. "And ask Warren Holt to bring whatever written correspondence he's had with the county assessor's office, even if it looks like nothing." Elias got up. He was halfway to the door before he stopped. "Ruth Connolly lost her husband in April," he said. "She's managing that place alone with her brother-in-law." "I know," Mara said, "which means she's been dealing with Crow's pressure while grieving and holding a ranch together without help. She deserves to be in that room as much as anyone." He didn't argue with that. He went to saddle his horse. The meeting happened 2 days later, on a Sunday afternoon when the work could pause for a few hours without the sky falling. 7 people around the Rourke kitchen table: Elias and Mara, Warren and Clara Holt, Henri Delacroix and his son Pierre, and Ruth Connolly, who arrived in a wagon she drove herself, her brother-in-law having thrown out his back. She was a small woman of about 55 with iron-gray hair and the kind of stillness that comes from learning not to let other people see when something has cost you. Mara had made coffee and 2 pans of cornbread and moved everything else off the kitchen table so there was room to spread papers out. Elias had his ledger. Warren Holt had a folder of letters from the county assessor's office. Ruth Connolly had a cloth bag from which she produced a tightly bundled stack of notes, organized by date, in handwriting so small it seemed designed to fit as much as possible into the smallest possible space. Mara looked at Ruth's notes and felt something that was close to recognition. "You've been doing this for a while," she said. Ruth sat down and smoothed her skirt with both hands. "My husband started it, after the first fence cutting." She looked around the table. "He believed in having a record of things. He said you never know what becomes evidence." She said it steadily, but the past tense of it, he said, he believed, landed in the room and everyone heard it, and nobody made the mistake of acknowledging it. They spent the afternoon going through everything. It was slow and sometimes frustrating work. Memories didn't always align with dates, and some of the damage had been repaired before anyone thought to write down the details. But what emerged, laid out across the table in the slant of Sunday afternoon light, was a pattern that was impossible to mistake once you could see the whole of it. Crow had made an offer to every ranch in the valley within the past 18 months. The offers had been low, lower than the land was worth, lower than what any of them needed to start over somewhere else. All had refused, and in the weeks following each refusal, something had gone wrong. Fences, cattle, water, equipment, small enough individually to be attributed to misfortune. Taken together, it was a map. He's been doing this for 2 years, Pierre Delacroix said. He was 24, younger than the rest of them, and he had the look of someone who'd just had something he'd suspected confirmed and didn't find it satisfying in the way he'd expected. The Garfield family, over on the Eastern Ridge, they sold last spring, said they couldn't keep up with the losses. They sold to Crow? Mara asked. Through a third party, Warren said. A land company out of Cheyenne. But everyone knows who's behind it. Does anyone have documentation of the Garfield sale, the terms? Warren and Ruth looked at each other. Probably county record, Ruth said. Then we get it, Mara said. Every sale that went through in this valley in the last 2 years, we get the county record. If Crow is buying through a shell company, that's going to be visible if you know what you're looking for. She paused. Does anyone know a lawyer in Cheyenne? Someone outside Crow's reach? Silence. Then Ruth said, My husband's brother is a clerk in the county court, not a lawyer, but he knows who's reputable. Good, Mara said. That's where we start. Elias had been quiet through much of the meeting, which she'd expected. He wasn't a man who talked in groups easily, but she'd noticed him watching the others, watching Warren Holt's jaw tighten at the assessment letters, watching Ruth Connolly's hands stay folded and still, even while her notes told a story of 2 years of deliberate destruction. She could see the thing happening in him that she'd been waiting for, the slow dissolving of the conviction that he was alone in this. After the others had gone, he stood in the kitchen while she cleaned up the coffee cups, and he was quiet for long enough that she knew something was working its way out. Ruth's place, he said finally. Her fences are worse than mine. I've been past it on the North Road. I know, Mara said. I could send Caleb and Pierre over this week to help with the worst of it. She stopped washing the cup she was holding and looked at him. He was looking at the table, not at her, with the expression of a man who has just said something he didn't entirely intend to say and is now examining whether he meant it. That's a good idea, she said. She went back to the washing. Don't make it a thing, he said. I'm not making it anything, she said, and meant it. The following weeks had a momentum to them that the valley hadn't felt in a long time. The ranchers began visiting each other openly, which was itself a kind of message. The furtive, casual dropping by of the previous weeks gave way to purposeful trips with tools and labor, and the frank acknowledgement that they were doing what Crow had worked to prevent them from doing. Warren Holt and Elias rebuilt the long fence section along the Rourke South pasture in a single day, working with a steadiness and a mutual competence that didn't require much talking. Pierre Delacroix showed up the following morning with 2 other young men from the North Ridge, friends of his, ranchers' sons who'd grown up watching their fathers absorb losses alone, and they spent 3 days repairing the Holt property's damaged outbuildings. In the Rourke kitchen, Mara cooked for whoever showed up. It became a kind of open house without any formal declaration. People arrived at mealtimes, left when they needed to, took food with them when they went. June turned out to have a genuine gift for feeding a crowd, her earlier interest in baking having expanded into a proprietary command of the kitchen's rhythms that made Mara genuinely proud. May organized the supply runs. Noah drew a map of all the valley properties, detailed and accurate in a way that seemed beyond his 8 years, which got pinned to the kitchen wall and used as a reference more times than anyone expected. The children were healing in the disorganized, non-linear way that healing actually works. There were still bad days. Caleb went silent again for 2 full days in the second week of August, and when Mara found him in the barn, she didn't try to draw him out the way she had before. She just brought a lantern and sat nearby and let him be silent in company instead of alone. And by the second evening, he'd started talking again. Not about his mother, about nothing in particular, the way people talk when they need to remember that someone is listening. Elsie was the one who surprised her most, and in the smallest way. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Mara was attempting to fix the kitchen window latch, which had been stiff since she arrived, and had finally decided to stop working entirely. She was balanced on the kitchen stool with a screwdriver and a degree of frustration she was trying not to take out on the hardware, when Elsie appeared beside her and said, without preamble, "You need to angle it. The frame's warped on the left side." Mara angled it. The latch caught perfectly. She looked down at Elsie. Elsie looked back with her usual expression of composed self-containment, but there was something behind it that was different now. Something that was not yet warmth, but was at least the absence of the cold. It was the face of a girl who had decided, without making any announcement about it, to extend a provisional trust. "How did you know that?" Mara asked. "Mama showed me," Elsie said. Then she went back to whatever she'd been doing, and Mara stood on the kitchen stool for a moment longer with the screwdriver in her hand and let that sentence be what it was without reaching for it. Toby remained as one who kept her honestly uncertain. He was closer to her than he'd been. She knew that from small things, from the way he positioned himself in rooms, from the fact that he'd started bringing Buck to the kitchen in the mornings and setting the horse on the corner of the table while she made breakfast, as though Buck needed to be in the room too. But the silence between them was still present, still specific to her. She'd stopped trying to cross it directly. She talked to him the way she talked to the chickens, not requiring a response, just making sure there was a voice in the space. She narrated what she was doing in the kitchen. She described the horses she could see through the window. She told him, one morning while he sat on the counter watching her knead bread, that her own mother had made bread every Thursday morning, and that the smell of it still meant Thursday to her, even when she'd lost track of the days. Toby watched her hands in the dough and said nothing, but he didn't leave. The county notice arrived on a Thursday, and Mara's first thought when she read it was that Crow's timing was exact. Not lazy or approximate, but precisely calibrated to hit when the repair work on the Valley ranches was still incomplete and the legal case was still being assembled. The notice informed Elias Rourke that his property had been selected for a special assessment review to be conducted by the county in 30 days. The stated purpose was to ensure accurate taxation in light of recent land value fluctuations in the Iron Hollow territory. The language was bureaucratic and bloodless, and exactly as threatening as it intended to be. Elias read it twice. Then he set it on the kitchen table beside his morning coffee and looked at it the way a man looks at a snake he's found in his boot. "Tanner," he said. "Has to be," Mara said. 30 days isn't much time." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She sat down across from him. "But it's enough time to have a lawyer look at the assessment procedure and tell us whether this is legal. And it's enough time to file a response with the county." She tapped the paper. "This is still paper. It has to go through a process. Processes have rules. Crow knows the rules better than we do." "He knows them as weapons," Mara said. "We need someone who knows them as shields." She looked at him steadily. "Ruth's brother-in-law. Can she get us a name by end of week?" Elias pushed back from the table and stood. "I'll ride over this afternoon." He did. Ruth produced a name, a lawyer in Cheyenne named Aldous Greer, who had represented 2 other rural landowners in assessment disputes, and had what Ruth's brother-in-law described as no interest in being in Crow's pocket, if that's what you're worried about. Mara wrote the letter to Greer herself, because Elias's written language tended toward the blunt, and she knew that a lawyer needed to understand not just the facts, but the pattern. She spent 2 evenings on it, writing and crossing out and rewriting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, the lamp burning low, the house settling around her with its particular nighttime sounds. Elias came downstairs the second night and found her still at it. He looked at the pages spread across the table and then at her, and he poured himself water from the pitcher and pulled out a chair and sat down. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Someone has to write it clearly," she said without looking up. "I could hire a secretary in town." "With what?" she said, and immediately regretted the bluntness of it. She hadn't meant it as a criticism, just as a fact, but it landed in the air between them, and she felt him take it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean—" "No," he said. "You're right. He looked at his water glass. The assessment. If it goes through as filed, I won't be able to cover the taxes. She set down her pen. I know. I've got maybe one season of reserves left. If we have a bad winter, or if the cattle prices drop again. He stopped. He had the look of a man recounting something he'd been doing the arithmetic on for weeks, alone, and it wasn't adding up. The letter will help, Mara said. And if Greer agrees to take the case, and if we can get the county to delay the assessment, that's a lot of ifs. Yes, she said. It is. She looked at him directly. Elias, do you still want to fight this? He looked up. The question seemed to have caught him slightly off guard, as though he'd been so consumed by the how of it that the yes or no had become invisible. Yes, he said. Then the ifs are manageable, she said. One at a time. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the papers on the table, at the handwriting that wasn't his, at the evidence of someone spending their evening on a problem that wasn't theirs to solve. The lamp was burning low, and the house was quiet, and outside the window the valley was just dark shapes in distance and the sound of wind. My wife, he said carefully, and the words still cost him something. She could see it. She used to say I thought too much and talked too little, that I'd rather do a thing wrong by myself than right with someone else's help. He paused. She wasn't wrong. Mara said nothing. She let it be. I'm not good at this, he said. At accepting... He made a gesture that took in the table, the papers, the whole arrangement of the past weeks. At not doing it alone. I know, Mara said. You're getting better at it. He almost made that sound again, the one that was close to a laugh but didn't quite arrive. He finished his water and stood up. I'll get you more lamp oil, he said. You'll burn through this one in an hour. He came back with the oil and refilled the lamp and went back upstairs, and Mara went back to the letter. And she was aware, in the particular way you become aware of things that are changing while you're looking directly at them, that something between her and Elias Rourke had shifted again tonight, very slightly, the way land shifts sometimes, quiet and underground and only visible later in what is moved. She sealed the letter 3 days later and sent it with Pierre Delacroix, who was making a supply run to Cheyenne. On the same day, 11 of Elias's cattle went missing. Elias found it in the early morning count. The gate on the east pasture had been opened during the night, and 11 head were simply gone. Not escaped. The latch had been lifted from the outside. He rode the fence line for 2 hours looking for them and found nothing. And when he came back to the house, his face was the face of a man who has been hit in the same place too many times and is now somewhere past anger, in the quieter and more dangerous territory beyond it. He didn't say anything when he came in. He sat down and drank coffee and stared at the table. Mara put the information in the ledger and wrote the date and the number and added it to the file she was building for Aldous Greer. Then she went out to the yard and told Warren Holt, who had arrived that morning to help Pierre and Caleb with the roof repair on the small equipment shed, what had happened. Warren looked at the empty pasture for a long moment. He's accelerating, he said. Yes, Mara said, trying to break Elias before the lawyer gets involved. That's what it looks like. Warren turned and looked at the house. At the window where they could both see the top of Elias's head, still at the kitchen table. He won't break, Warren said. It wasn't wishful thinking. It was an assessment, the kind a man makes about another man he's known for years. No, Mara agreed, but he can be damaged enough that it doesn't matter. She went back inside and told Elias about Greer's likely timeline, about the Valley Ranchers' plan to begin a joint watch on the border properties at night, about the fact that Ruth Connolly had found a reference in her husband's papers to a complaint filed against Crow's Land Company 2 years ago in a neighboring county. Dropped, but filed, which meant there was a record. She laid it all out methodically, and he listened and nodded and said, all right, to each point, and she could see him doing what he did, taking what was in front of him and making it the next thing to do, refusing to be stopped by the size of the hole. It was what she admired most about him, and it was also, she thought, what had been destroying him. The fact that he'd been applying that quality only to physical work, to doing and fixing and maintaining, and not to asking anyone to stand beside him. The week that followed was the hardest since Mara had arrived. The cattle search turned up 7 head over 3 days. Animals spooked and scattered rather than stolen, which suggested the goal had been disruption rather than theft, which was somehow worse because it was so deliberate. The county sent a follow-up notice about the assessment. Two of the night watches turned up nothing, and on the third night, Pierre Delacroix and one of his friends found fresh boot prints along the north fence line of the Holt property, but no one attached to them. On the fourth night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in her room at the end of the hall and listened to the house and the valley beyond it, and told herself it was the heat, which was real, August pressing down on everything with its particular weight. She got up and went to the window and stood looking out at the yard and the dark shape of the barn and the black line of the fence beyond it. The children were all asleep. She could hear Toby's particular pattern of breathing from 2 doors down. He slept with his door open now, which she'd noticed without remarking on. Elias's room was quiet. The yard was quiet. And then it wasn't. She saw it before she understood it. A flicker at the base of the barn wall, small and orange, the kind of light that doesn't belong in a dark yard at 4 in the morning. She stood completely still for 2 full seconds, watching it, and in those 2 seconds it went from a flicker to something unmistakable. She was moving before the second was done. She ran down the hall, down the stairs, through the kitchen, barefoot on the porch boards, and into the yard, and she was screaming for Elias before she was halfway to the barn because the smell hit her then. The sharp chemical bite underneath the wood smoke that told her this was not an accident. This was not a kicked-over lantern or a pile of hay that had gotten too warm in the summer heat. This was deliberate. Elias was at his window in seconds, and then outside in less than a minute, and she could hear the horses inside the barn now. Their noise, the urgent, percussive sound of animals who understand what fire means before humans finish understanding it. Elias ran for the barn door. Mara was a step behind him. The fire had started at the west corner and was moving fast along the wall. Whoever had set it knew where to set it for maximum speed. The horses were frantic, their stall doors banging, Murphy's screaming rising above everything. Elias unlatched the first 2 stalls, and the horses bolted past them, and Mara unlatched the third, coughing, the smoke already thick at shoulder height, moving toward the ground as the fire ate upward. She could see the far end of the barn, and it was an orange wall, and she thought, "We have maybe 2 minutes, less." She was reaching for the 4th stall latch when she heard it. Over the horses, over the fire, over Elias shouting from somewhere behind her. A child's voice, high and desperate and unmistakable. Toby. She didn't think. The decision was not a decision, it was a response, the way breathing is a response, the way your hand pulls back from a hot stove before your mind has finished asking what happened. She turned and ran toward the sound. He was in the back corner of the barn, the place he sometimes came in the evenings when he couldn't sleep, the corner where he'd made a small nest of old sacking near the grain bins, the corner that was now surrounded on 2 sides by fire that had found the dry summer hay and was moving with appalling speed. He was standing absolutely still, not screaming anymore. Buck pressed to his chest with both arms. The terror had gone through panic and out the other side into a stillness that was somehow worse. Mara threw herself across the space between them and grabbed him, and he grabbed her back with a strength she hadn't known a 4-year-old could have. His arms around her neck, Buck crushed between them. She turned back toward the door and the beam came down behind her. She felt the heat of it before she heard the crack, and she threw herself forward and to the right, and the beam hit the ground a foot to her left, and she felt something catch and burn across her left shoulder, and she did not stop. She did not stop. She ran with Toby pressed against her chest and Buck between them and the barn coming apart above them in a roar of heat and cracking wood, and she could see the rectangle of the barn door ahead, darker than the fire, the outside air beyond it cool and enormous. Elias was there. He had come back in for them. She saw him at the door, his face doing something she had never seen it do, the absolute dissolution of every hard thing he kept on it, and he reached for Toby and she transferred the boy into his arms, and they were outside, all 3 of them, in the yard, and the barn behind them exhaled a great column of heat and sparks into the black August sky. Elias held his son. He held him with both arms, bent over him, his face buried in the boy's hair, and he made a sound that was not a word, not anything with language in it, just the sound a person makes when the thing they were most afraid of has just almost happened and hasn't. Toby still had Buck. Mara stood in the yard with her left shoulder burning and her lungs full of smoke and her feet bare on the dirt, and she looked at the barn, at what was left of it, and she breathed. Around them the valley was waking up. Lights coming on in distant windows, the sound of horses being woken and ridden fast, because a fire in the night is visible from a long way, and in this valley now, the people were watching for each other. Warren Holt arrived in 20 minutes, Pierre Delacroix in 30. Ruth Connolly's brother-in-law, despite his back, showed up with 2 buckets and the grim competence of a man who has fought a fire before. They couldn't save the barn, but they kept it from the house, and they kept it from spreading to the dry grass of the south pasture. And by the time the sky began to lighten in the east, the fire had burned itself to coals, and the Rourke family was sitting on the porch, and Mara's shoulder had been wrapped in a strip of clean linen by Clara Holt, who said it would blister, but it wasn't deep. Elias sat on the porch steps with Toby asleep against his chest. The boy finally surrendered to exhaustion, Buck still in his small hands. Elias's face was the face he had after the fire had taken everything except what was sitting on his chest, stripped back to something that was just him, without the armor. He looked at Mara, sitting in the porch chair with her shoulder wrapped, and there was nothing careful or measuring in his expression. There was just the look of a man who has seen something he is not going to be able to go back from. "You went in there," he said. "He was inside," Mara said. "You went in there," he said again, not as an argument, just as a fact he was still processing. She said nothing. He looked down at Toby. "I heard him screaming," he said. "I was at the horses. I heard him, and He stopped. "He's safe," Mara said. "Because of you." She didn't have an answer to that felt right, so she didn't try to find one. She just sat in the porch chair with her shoulder throbbing and the smell of smoke in her hair and watched the dawn come up over Iron Hollow Valley. When the fire investigator arrived 2 days later, called for by Warren Holt, who had connections in the next county, he walked the burn site for less than an hour before he found what he was looking for. 3 separate points of ignition, each set with the same method. Accelerant at each one, still faintly detectable to a man who knew what he was smelling for. He delivered his findings to the assembled ranchers in the Rourke kitchen, standing at the table because all the chairs were taken, and he said the words clearly and without embellishment. This was not an accident. The room was silent for a moment. Then Ruth Connolly unfolded her hands in her lap and looked at the investigator and said, "Can you put that in writing?" "Already planning to," he said. And Mara, sitting at the end of the table with her shoulders still wrapped and her face still carrying the marks of the smoke, looked around the room at the faces of the people who had come. Warren and Clara, Pierre and his father, Ruth, the Pearson family, 2 younger ranchers from the Ridge who hadn't been part of the first meetings but were here now. And she understood that Crow had made the worst kind of mistake. He had tried to end this quietly, over time, through 100 small damages that could each be explained away. And then he had done something that couldn't. The fire had been meant to break them. Instead, it had made them visible to each other in the way that only a shared emergency can do, stripped down and certain and no longer inclined to patience. Silas Crow had not broken the valley. He had finished building it. The fire investigator's written report arrived 4 days later, and Mara read it at the kitchen table twice before she passed it to Elias. It was 3 pages, precise and unambiguous, and it used the word deliberate 4 times. She had not counted intentionally. She noticed it afterward, the way you notice something that keeps arriving. Elias read it once and set it down and said nothing for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. The twins were outside, Noah was in his room, Caleb was helping Pierre with the fence repair that had resumed the morning after the fire, because there was nothing else to do with the anger except work. Toby was at the kitchen table with them, sitting in his usual chair with Buck in front of him on the table, turned to face outward the way Toby always positioned him, as though the horse needed to see the room. Elias put his hand flat on the report and looked at it. "I want to take this to Crow's property and put it on his table," he said. "I know," Mara said. "I want to look him in the face when he reads it." "I know that too." She poured more coffee into his cup. "And he would have 3 lawyers in that room within the hour, and you'd be the man who showed up at his property making threats. And this," she tapped the report, "becomes the thing that got buried underneath that." Elias looked up at her. The anger in him was visible in a way it hadn't been before the fire. Not the controlled, contained anger of the previous weeks, but something rawer, something that had been sitting close to the surface since the night he'd held Toby on the porch steps and understood how close it had been. "So we just sit here," he said. "We don't sit anywhere," Mara said. "We send this to Aldous Greer today. We take it to the county sheriff with a formal complaint, on record, signed by every rancher in this valley. We make it impossible to ignore." She met his eyes. "Crow's been invisible because everyone's been dealing with him privately. We put this in official hands and suddenly he has to deal with it publicly. That's where he's weakest." Toby, without looking up from Buck, said, "Is the bad man going to come here again?" The question landed in the room like something fragile dropped on a hard floor. Elias looked at it. Was the first full sentence Toby had directed at either of them in months. Not at the chickens, not at Buck, not murmured to Noah on the porch. At them. At the room. Elias set down his coffee cup very carefully. "No," he said. "He's not going to come here again." Toby looked at Buck. "Promise?" Elias looked at Mara for just a moment. The look of a father who knows better than to make a promise he can't guarantee but is going to make it anyway because his 4-year-old is asking. "Promise," he said. Toby nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned Buck slightly to the left. Mara picked up the fire investigator's report and began drafting the letter to Greer in her head, because the promise Elias had just made to his son needed to become true, and the way to make it true was to start the next thing immediately. The formal complaint to the sheriff's office was filed 2 days later. 7 signatures. The fire report attached. 3 pages of documented incidents with dates. Warren Holt's assessment correspondence. Ruth Connolly's 2 years of careful handwritten notes. Sheriff Aldous Briggs was a man of about 60 who had been in Iron Hollow Valley his entire adult life and had the particular quality of small-town law. He knew everyone and owed no one anything catastrophic, but he also moved slowly and preferred the known shape of things to complications. He received the complaint at his desk with his reading glasses on and worked through it without speaking for 15 minutes while Elias and Warren Holt sat across from him. When he finished, he took off his glasses and set them on the papers. "This is a serious set of allegations," he said. "Yes," Elias said. "It is." Crow is going to say the fire was accidental. "The investigator's report is pretty clear about what it was," Warren said. "I know what the report says." Briggs rubbed his face with one hand. He was not a bad man. Mara had asked around before they went, in the quiet way she asked around about things, and the general consensus was that Briggs was cautious and not corrupt, which in Iron Hollow Valley counted for quite a lot. "I'm telling you what I'm going to hear when I bring this to him." "Then bring it to him," Elias said. "Formally, on record, so that whatever he says in response is also on record." Briggs looked at Elias for a moment. Something passed through his expression. A reassessment of some kind, the look of a man who expected one conversation and is getting another. "You've got legal counsel?" "Letter went to Aldous Greer in Cheyenne 4 days ago." Briggs nodded slowly. He put his glasses back on and looked at the complaint again. "I'll be in touch by end of week," he said. They rode back without talking much. Warren Holt broke the silence at the ridge fork where their roads separated. "He'll actually do something," he said. "I wasn't sure, but he'll do something." "Depends what Crow does next," Elias said. "Yes," Warren agreed, "it does." What Crow did next was not what any of them expected. He did nothing. For 11 days, nothing happened. No cut fences, no missing cattle, no county notices. No men standing outside the saloon watching the street. The valley had the suspended quality of weather that is gathering itself. And the ranchers felt it and kept the night watches going and stayed alert without knowing exactly what they were alert for. Mara used the 11 days. She wrote 3 more letters to Greer, each with new documentation. She organized the accumulated evidence into a system that Ruth Connolly helped her cross-reference by date and category: property damage, financial pressure, county interference, threats. Ruth had a clerk's mind beneath her farmer's hands, and the 2 women spent long evenings at the kitchen table building a record that was as close to airtight as they could make it with what they had. Elias watched this from a careful distance, which was his way of participating. One evening, near the end of the 2nd week, Greer's reply arrived. It was 8 pages. Mara read it at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and Elias read it after her, and then they sat together for a moment in the lamplight with the pages between them. Greer believed there was a case. Not a certain case, he was careful to say that, and she appreciated his carefulness because it meant he was being honest rather than encouraging. But a real case, built on the pattern of the documented incidents, the fire investigator's report, and what he called the systematic and financially motivated nature of the alleged interference. He outlined what he would need and what the process would look like and what the likely obstacles were. and his assessment of Tanner's vulnerability was pointed. An assessor who has accepted hospitality from a party with active financial interest in the assessments he oversees has a problem that doesn't require proof of direct payment to be significant. He thinks Tanner is the weak point, Elias said. He thinks Tanner is the visible point, Mara corrected. Crow is the weak point, but Tanner is the door. Elias looked at the pages. We need more than what we have on Tanner. Yes, Mara said, we do. The more arrived from a direction neither of them had anticipated. His name was Cole Mercer, and he showed up at the Rourke Gate on a Thursday morning in the third week of August on a horse that was good quality but not showy, the kind of animal a man chooses when he doesn't want to be noticed. He was somewhere around 40, lean and weathered with careful eyes, and the manner of someone who has spent a significant portion of his life paying attention to exits. Caleb was the one who found him at the gate, and Caleb came to get Mara rather than his father, which was interesting in itself. It said something about who Caleb had decided was the right person to handle something uncertain. Mara went to the gate. The man on the horse looked at her with those careful eyes and said, I'm looking for the people who filed the complaint against Silas Crow. Why? She said. Because I worked for him for 4 years, Cole Mercer said, and I've been trying to decide whether to do something about it for most of that time, and the fire made up my mind. Mara looked at him steadily. She was thinking 3 things simultaneously: that this could be genuine, that this could be a plant, and that the only way to know was to hear what he had and see whether it held together. Get down off the horse, she said. We'll talk inside. She put him at the kitchen table and got Elias, and Elias came in with the expression he wore when he was prepared for something to be a problem. He looked at Cole Mercer the way he looked at most things, measuring, not hostile, but not warm either. Cole Mercer talked for almost 2 hours. He had been, for 4 years, part of what he called Crow's operation, a deliberately vague term that covered a range of activities from ordinary ranch management to the kind of work that didn't get written down. He had been involved in some of the fence cuttings. He had helped with the repositioning of the Pearson irrigation blockage, though he said he hadn't known at the time that it was what it was. He had not been involved in the fire and said so with a directness that felt like the first time he'd raised his voice in the conversation. When I heard about the fire, he said, I knew what it was. I've seen him escalate before, when someone didn't fall. But a child was inside that barn. He paused. I have children. Mara said, what do you have that we don't? Cole reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope. Inside were 3 documents, copies, not originals, but copies in detail. 2 were correspondence between Crow and someone identified only as BT, which Mara recognized immediately as Bill Tanner, and the third was a ledger page in Crow's handwriting showing payments to 2 county officials, one of whom matched Tanner's initials and salary structure. Elias picked up the ledger page and looked at it. Something moved across his face. Where did you get these? He asked. I was trusted with a lot of things, Cole said, including access to files he didn't know I could read. Why now? Elias said. Cole looked at the table. I told you. The fire. That's the reason, Elias said. I'm asking why now instead of before. Cole was quiet for a moment. Because before, I told myself it was business. Property deals that were hard but legal. People getting pressured but not hurt. He looked up. A 4-year-old in a burning barn is not business. The room was quiet. Mara looked at the documents again. She looked at Cole Mercer's face, at the specific quality of discomfort in it. Not performance, not strategy, but the genuine look of a man who has been carrying something at cost and is putting it down and doesn't know yet if he's made the right choice. She had seen that look before, on her own face, in the months after Thomas died when she was deciding things. She picked up the ledger page. Will you testify to the origin of these? Cole met her eyes. That's why I'm here, he said. Elias looked at Mara. She gave him the smallest nod, not telling him what to decide, just confirming her own read, which he'd started to look for in a way neither of them had acknowledged. You'll need to talk to our lawyer, Elias said. Aldous Greer in Cheyenne. I know who he is, Cole said. I'll talk to him. And you understand that Crow will know you've done this? Yes, Cole said. He said it simply, without drama, the way a man says something he's already finished arguing with himself about. Elias reached across the table and extended his hand. Cole Mercer shook it. Mara sent Greer a letter that afternoon with a summary of what Cole had brought and a request for the fastest possible response. Then she went out to the yard where Caleb was splitting kindling, taking over a task that had been Elias's, and doing it with a focused competence that was new, one of those small shifts that had been happening in the boy for weeks. And she told him he'd done the right thing by coming to get her at the gate. Caleb kept splitting. "I figured Dad would want to punch him first and ask questions after," he said. Mara laughed. It was a real laugh which surprised her slightly. "Probably," she said. Caleb looked up at her with an expression that was entirely itself. Not quite a smile, not quite serious, something in between that was just Caleb. "You're better at the talking part," he said. "Dad's better at the other parts." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over. There was a truth in it that was simpler than she usually let herself consider. The idea that they were actually good at different things, that this was not a coincidence or an arrangement, but something more like a fit. Greer replied within the week. He had reviewed her summary of Cole Mercer's documents, and he wanted to move. The county hearing on the assessment dispute was scheduled for the following month, which was sooner than he'd initially planned to be ready, but the documents from Cole, if Cole would testify, changed the calculation. What had been a case built on pattern and inference was now a case with paper behind it. He also had news about Tanner, a county commissioner named Edward Park, who represented 3 districts, including Iron Hollow, had apparently been asking his own questions about the assessment process for some time, not connected to the Rourke complaint, but not inconsistent with it either. Park was a man with a reputation for taking the bureaucratic rules seriously, which meant he was either incorruptible or very good at pretending, and Greer believed the former. Mara wrote to Commissioner Park directly. She did it carefully, in the plain language she used when she wanted someone to actually read what she'd written, rather than skim it. No arguments, no accusations, just a detailed chronology with attached documentation and a straightforward account of what the Valley Ranchers had experienced and what the fire investigator had found. She asked for nothing specific. She laid out what was true and left the conclusions to the man who had the authority to act on them. Elias read the letter before she sent it. He read it twice, which she'd learned was his way of saying it was good. "You didn't ask him for anything," he said. "I asked him to look at what we sent him," she said. "That's all I need him to do." He handed the letter back. "All right." She sealed it. What happened inside the Rourke house in those weeks was quieter than what was happening with lawyers and county commissioners, but in some ways it mattered more. Toby had started talking. Not all at once. Nothing about the children happened all at once. But the sentence at the kitchen table, the one that had stopped the room, had been the beginning of something that kept going. He asked questions now. Small ones, tentative, the conversational testing of a child who is relearning that questions get answers. He asked Mara what she was making, in the kitchen, in the mornings. He asked Elias what the weather was going to do. He asked May once, very seriously, why her hair was always coming out of its braid, and May had been so delighted by the question that she'd hugged him so hard he'd made an indignant noise, which made everyone at the table laugh. And Toby had looked around at the laughing faces with an expression of pure surprise, as though he'd expected a different reaction to what he'd said, and this one was better. Buck still went everywhere, but Toby had started setting the horse on the windowsill when he sat at the kitchen table, rather than holding him through every meal. It was a very small adjustment. It was enormous. Elsie came to Mara one evening toward the end of the month with a question she'd been clearly assembling for some time. Mara could tell by the way Elsie stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, chin at the specific angle she used when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for longer than she was willing to admit. "If the hearing goes wrong," Elsie said, "if we lose the ranch, what happens to us?" Mara set down what she was doing and looked at Elsie directly, because Elsie was 13 and had been carrying adult fears since April, and she deserved a direct answer, not a comfortable one. "I don't know the exact shape of it," Mara said, "but your father would not let this family fall apart, and neither would I." "You'd stay?" Elsie said. "Even if—" "Yes," Mara said, simply, without qualification, the way you say things you mean without needing to decorate them. Elsie uncrossed her arms. She looked at the floor for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was slightly lower than usual, "Okay," and went back upstairs. Mara stood in the kitchen for a moment after she left, feeling the weight of that okay. the way it carried both a question and the answer she'd given it and what was being built between them, slowly, without any formal declaration, the way most of the real things got built. Elias heard about the conversation from Elsie herself, which surprised Mara when he mentioned it. She hadn't expected Elsie to repeat it. "She told you?" Mara asked. "She tells me more than I usually know what to do with," he said. "Since lately." He was quiet for a moment. "She said you told her you'd stay." "I did," Mara said. He looked at her. The evening light was doing what it did this time of year, coming through the west window at a long angle, and the kitchen had the particular warmth of a room that has been lived in and cooked in and argued in and laughed in for months, the kind of warmth that accumulates rather than being added deliberately. "I'm going to hold you to that," he said. "I know," she said. He nodded as though something had been confirmed and went to call the children for supper. Commissioner Park's office sent a reply within 2 weeks. It was formal and careful, as official correspondence tends to be, but what it said between the careful lines was significant. The commissioner's office had initiated a review of assessment procedures in Iron Hollow and 2 neighboring territories, and the documentation submitted by the ranchers of Iron Hollow Valley would be entered into the official record of that review. Tanner apparently had been aware something was coming. He resigned his position 11 days before the county hearing, citing health reasons, in language that fooled nobody but provided a face-saving exit. The news reached the Rourke kitchen through Warren Holt, who had heard it from the feed store owner, who had heard it from someone in town. The way news travels in small places, arrived everywhere almost at once and from no single identifiable direction. Mara received it without celebrating, because Tanner's departure was not the resolution. It was the ground shifting. It was Crow's infrastructure beginning to move. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in mid-September, in the county seat 12 miles from Iron Hollow. Greer had come down from Cheyenne the previous week to prepare, a tall man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and a way of speaking that was both precise and unhurried. He met with Cole Mercer twice, with the assembled ranchers once, and with Mara for 2 full evenings going through the documentation in the order he planned to present it. After the second evening, when Elias had gone to bed and the children were asleep, and Greer was putting the papers back into their folders, he looked at Mara across the table and said, "You built this. The record. Most of what we're walking in with is organized the way you organized it." "Ruth Connolly organized a good portion of it," Mara said. "True. But the framework." He tapped the folder. "That's yours." She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she said, "Will it be enough?" Greer considered the question honestly, which she appreciated. Crow is going to argue coincidence on the property damage. He's going to distance himself from Tanner. He's going to attack Cole Mercer's credibility. He paused. But the ledger page, the correspondence, and Commissioner Park having already opened an independent review. He organized the last folder. "I've walked into county hearings with less." The morning of the hearing, the Rourke kitchen was full before dawn, not because anyone had planned it, but because people came. Warren and Clara Holt arrived at 6, Ruth Connolly at past. The Pearson family, Henri and Pierre Delacroix, 2 of the younger ranchers from the Ridge. Mara made coffee, and the twins made toast in quantities that would have been comic under different circumstances. And Noah sat at the corner of the table and drew in his sketchbook with the quick, concentrated movements he used when he was storing something. Elias stood by the door in his good jacket, which Mara had pressed the night before, and looked at the people in his kitchen, and she watched him look at them. Watched him take in the specific fact of all these people in this room at this hour. And she saw something cross his face that was not composure, not the careful blankness he used in public, but something genuine and not quite resolved. He found her eyes across the room. He didn't say anything. She nodded once. He put on his hat and opened the door and said, "Let's go." They rode to the county seat in a line of wagons and horses that was longer than anyone had planned, because people kept joining. Families from the outer ridge who hadn't been part of the meetings but had been watching and had decided they wanted to be counted. Young Henri Delacroix's friends. Ruth Connolly's brother-in-law, his back sufficiently recovered. By the time they reached the county building, it was not the 7 ranchers who had signed the original complaint, but 23 people who lined the benches of the county hearing room and made it impossible to pretend that what was happening was a small administrative matter. Silas Crow arrived with 2 lawyers and 4 men who were not lawyers and stood in the aisle looking at the assembled Valley ranchers with an expression that Mara watched closely. He had not expected this. Whatever he had expected, a handful of struggling landowners easily dismissed. This was not it. His expression recalibrated in the space of about 2 seconds, smoothing back to the confident neutrality of a man who knows how to adjust. But she'd seen the 2 seconds before the adjustment, and she filed them. Greer was precise and methodical and took apart the assessment against the Rourke property with the care of a man who understands that the most persuasive thing is not argument but sequence, laying one documented fact after another until the shape they made was impossible to mistake. Cole Mercer testified. He was not a comfortable witness. He shifted in his chair and his voice was flat with the particular tension of a man saying difficult things in public. But the flatness worked in his favor because it didn't sound rehearsed. The documents he'd produced were authenticated by Greer's process and entered into the record, and the correspondence between Crow and the initials BT landed in the room with a weight that Crow's lawyers objected to 3 times, which only drew more attention to it. Commissioner Park was not present, but had submitted a formal statement. It was read into the record by the hearing officer, a woman named Della Marsh, who had an economy of expression that suggested she had read the documentation before today and formed opinions she was professional enough not to state directly. Her face when she read Park's statement said the rest. Crow's lawyers argued. They were good lawyers, experienced and organized. They attacked Cole Mercer's character and motivations. They argued that the fire investigator's report was speculative on the question of intent. They presented an alternative account of the assessment that attributed it entirely to legitimate land value fluctuation. It took 4 hours. The hearing officer announced that the special assessment against the Rourke property was suspended pending a full procedural review. She referred the evidence of county official misconduct to the appropriate oversight body. She noted, in language that was technically neutral and practically devastating, that the pattern of incidents documented by the Valley ranchers raised questions that extended beyond the scope of the current proceeding. It was not a full victory. It was the beginning of one, which is the kind of victory that actually holds. Crow left the building without looking at any of them. His lawyers were speaking to him in low voices, and he was walking with the tight, controlled movement of a man who is not accustomed to the ground moving under him. Outside, in the long September afternoon, the Valley ranchers stood together on the steps of the county building, and nobody said much for a moment. It was Warren Holt who spoke first, and what he said was not a speech, not a celebration, just 3 words addressed to the general air. "Well," Warren said. "All right." And that was about right. Elias found Mara at the edge of this group. He stood beside her. Not in front of her, not at a formal distance, just beside her, the way you stand next to someone when you're not trying to make a point about it. Greer says the oversight review of Tanner could take the land scheme apart entirely, he said. It could, Mara said. It'll take time. We have time, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the road, at the line of wagons and horses that was starting to form up for the ride back to Iron Hollow, at the people who had come. Yes, she said. We do. The ride home was louder than the ride out. By the time they got back to the valley, the light was going golden and long, and the Rourke kitchen, which Elsie had quietly taken charge of in their absence, produced supper for 23 people in shifts, with June commandeering the stove with an authority that made people twice her age step back and let her work. Caleb ate 3 helpings and didn't say much, but he sat in the middle of the room rather than at the edge of it, which was its own kind of statement. Noah gave Mara a drawing. He put it on the table beside her plate without announcement, and then went back to his seat and didn't look at her while she looked at it. It was the kitchen table, drawn from above, the bird's-eye view of a child with a draftsman's instinct, with small figures around it, each one distinct in some detail. May's escaping braid, June's flour-dusted apron, Caleb's particular angle of sitting, Elias's hat on the peg by the door, Ruth Connolly's folded hands, Toby with Buck on the table in front of him. And at the end of the table, a figure in an apron with the rolling pin she was never without in the mornings. Mara sat with the drawing for a moment, then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. Toby came to her after supper, when the room was full of people and noise and the comfortable chaos of a shared meal, and he stood beside her chair and looked at her with those serious eyes and held up Buck. Buck wants to sit with you, he said. Mara looked at the wooden horse. She looked at Toby. "He can sit with me," she said. Toby placed Buck carefully on the table in front of her. Then he climbed into the chair beside her and leaned against her arm with the easy, unconsidered trust of a child who has decided a person is safe and stayed there for the rest of the evening. Elias saw it from across the room. His face did the thing it had been doing more often lately, the thing where the hardness went out of it all at once, like a held breath let go. He looked away and looked back, and looked at Mara sitting at the end of his kitchen table with his son against her arm, and his daughter's drawing in her pocket, and 23 people eating in his house. And he stayed with that image for a long time, the way a man stays with something he knows he's going to need to say out loud soon, before it gets too large to say at all. The oversight review that Commissioner Park had initiated moved through the county bureaucracy the way these things always move, slowly, with the grinding deliberateness of a process that has no interest in anyone's urgency. October came. The burned barn foundation sat black and open at the edge of the yard, and every morning Elias looked at it from the kitchen window with an expression that Mara had learned to read accurately by now. It was not despair. It was the expression of a man keeping a tab, noting what was owed, waiting for the right moment to settle it. The legal machinery, once set in motion, proved harder to stop than Crow had anticipated. This was the thing about men who operated in shadows for long enough. They came to believe the shadows were structural, permanent, built into the landscape. They forgot that shadows depended on where the light was coming from, and that light could be redirected. Tanner's resignation had opened a crack, and Greer had put a lever in it. The oversight body's investigators arrived in Iron Hollow Valley on a Wednesday, in the second week of October, 2 men in clean coats who asked careful questions and wrote down the answers in identical notebooks. They spoke to Elias. They spoke to Warren Holt and Ruth Connolly and Henri Delacroix. They reviewed the assessment records going back 3 years. They requested the county's correspondence files, which Tanner had apparently not thought to clean out before he left, which turned out to be significant. Mara was not interviewed formally. She was a housekeeper, technically, and the investigators focused their attention on the landowners whose names were on the deeds. But on the second afternoon, one of the investigators, a younger man named Forsyth with observant eyes and ink on his left thumb, paused in the kitchen doorway while she was making coffee and said, "The documentation you organized for the Greer submission was exceptionally thorough." Ruth Connolly did most of the cross-referencing, Mara said. "Still," he said, "it made our job considerably easier." She handed him a cup of coffee, and he took it and nodded and went back to his notebooks. And she went back to the bread she was making, and that was the extent of it. But she felt the acknowledgement the way you feel something that arrives quietly, not loud enough to celebrate, but real. The investigators were in the valley for 4 days. When they left, they took 3 boxes of copied documents with them. Greer, who had come down from Cheyenne for the occasion, watched them load the boxes into their wagon and said to Elias, standing beside him at the gate, "That's what winning looks like at this stage. Unglamorous, but effective." Elias watched the wagon go. "When will we know?" "Official findings, 4 to 6 weeks. But the assessment against your property is already suspended. You're not losing this ranch." Greer paused. "There may still be legal proceedings against Crow. Could take a year depending on what they found in Tanner's files." "And Cole Mercer?" Greer's expression was careful. "He's cooperating fully. His testimony is significant. Whatever happens with Crow's case, Cole made himself a witness rather than an accomplice. That's the most he can do." Elias nodded. He looked at the burned foundation again, the daily accounting he was keeping. "Good," he said. The actual collapse of Crow's land scheme happened not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of smaller ones that accumulated over the following weeks into something irreversible. The oversight body's preliminary findings leaked into county gossip before the official report, the way these things always do, and Crow's name began appearing in conversations in town in a different register. Not feared, not powerful, but present in the way a damaged thing is present. Something people walk around carefully because they can see it's no longer stable. 2 of the land parcels he'd acquired through the shell company in Cheyenne were identified as having been purchased under fraudulent assessment conditions. The transaction records were referred to the territorial attorney's office. A 3rd complaint, from a Valley family named Garfield who had sold and moved to Colorado, was reopened on the basis of the new evidence. Crow did not appear in Iron Hollow for the entire month of October. His men were still on his property, but the ostentatious presence in town, the men outside the saloon, the calculated visibility of his operation, was gone. Mara heard through Clara Holt, who heard through the feed store owner, who heard from the wife of one of Crow's former employees, that Crow had gone to Cheyenne to meet with lawyers and had not come back yet. She filed this information in the part of her mind she kept for things that were relevant but not yet complete, and she went back to what needed doing. What needed doing, in October, was the barn. The Valley ranchers came back for it the way they'd come for the hearing. Not because anyone made a formal plan, but because it was the next right thing, and people showed up for next right things when they'd been reminded that showing up was possible. Warren Holt arrived on a Saturday morning with lumber he'd had milled at his own expense. Pierre Delacroix brought 4 men and a team of horses. Ruth Connolly's brother-in-law brought tools and a level and the particular expertise of a man who had built 3 structures in his life and knew where people made their mistakes. Elias stood in his yard on that first Saturday and looked at the people unloading lumber in his drive and did the thing he'd been doing more lately, the thing where he didn't hide what was happening on his face. He looked at Warren and said simply, "You didn't have to do this." "No," Warren agreed. "We didn't." He picked up a board and carried it to the site, and that was the end of the discussion. The barn went up over 3 weekends. It was not identical to the one that had burned. The new structure was slightly better designed, the hayloft positioned differently. The ventilation improved in ways that Ruth Connolly's brother-in-law insisted on, with a specificity born from watching one barn burn. The children were involved in ways appropriate to their ages and enthusiasms. May organized the food for the work crews with the same proprietary energy she'd brought to the pantry reorganization. June cooked alongside Mara with an authority that had quietly outgrown assistance and become collaboration. Noah drew the new barn at every stage: foundation, framing, walls, roof, a sequential record that he kept in a separate sketchbook he'd bought with his own carefully saved coins. Caleb worked. Not helping, not assisting, worked, alongside the men, with a focus and a stamina that made Warren Holt say to Elias quietly, on the second weekend, "That boy is going to be something." Elias watched his son drive a nail with 3 clean strokes and said, "I know." Toby supervised. He sat on an upturned bucket near the worksite with Buck on his knee and offered observations that were occasionally accurate and frequently inventive. When the framing went up on the second Saturday and the structure became recognizably barn-shaped, Toby looked at it for a long moment and said, "It's bigger than the other one." And Pierre Delacroix, who was on the ladder above him, said, "That's the idea, little man." And Toby considered this with great seriousness and then nodded his approval, and several people who were within earshot laughed, and the laugh was the kind that has relief in it. Mara watched all of this and felt something she didn't immediately name. It was a complex feeling, the kind that takes a while to identify because it's made of several things at once. There was satisfaction in it, and something that was close to peace, and underneath both of those, something that was neither exactly happy nor exactly sad. The bittersweet quality of watching a thing you helped build become real enough that it no longer needs you in the same way. That was the part she turned over carefully in her private moments. In the early mornings before anyone was up, sitting at the kitchen table with her first cup of coffee and the particular quality of light that came through the east window in October, low and clear and without the summer heat behind it. She had come to Iron Hollow Valley with $14 and a broken suitcase latch and a job description that had been carefully vague about what it would actually require. She had not come looking for a home. She had been, if she was honest with herself, running a quiet version of forward, moving towards something that wasn't quite visible rather than standing still in the wreckage of what Missouri had been. That kind of motion can look purposeful from the outside and feel like survival from the inside, and she was experienced enough now to understand that both descriptions can be true at once. What she had not anticipated was the way this place had made a claim on her that was different from the survival kind. It was not the dramatic claim of crisis and emergency, though there had been plenty of that. It was the daily kind. The specific weight of Toby against her arm at the supper table, Elsie's sideways trust, Noah's drawings in her bedside drawer, Caleb's voice in the barn growing louder by the week, the way the kitchen smelled at 6 in the morning when the stove was warming up, the sound of the valley at night, the slope of the mountains against the last light. She was thinking about all of this on the Monday morning after the barn's second construction weekend, sitting with her coffee in the still house, when Elias came downstairs earlier than usual. He stopped when he saw her at the table. She expected him to pour coffee and go back to the ledger or out to the animals. His morning routine was well established and didn't usually include sitting down before the children were up, but he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She waited. He had something to say. With Elias, you waited. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. The oversight report is going to come through before winter, he said. Greer thinks Crow's land company will be dissolved. Some of the acquisitions may be reversed. That's good, Mara said. The ranch is safe, he said. Or it will be, once the assessment is formally closed. Yes, she said. It will be. He was quiet again. She could see him working toward something. The specific quality of silence he had when he was arranging words that didn't come easily. When it's over, he said. When the legal pieces are finished and the barn is done and there's no more crisis to manage. He stopped, tried again. You came here for a job. I did, she said. The job had a particular set of circumstances. It did. He looked at her. I'm afraid, he said, that once those circumstances are resolved, you'll look at this place and see a working ranch in the middle of nowhere with 6 children and a man who talks too little, and you'll decide. He stopped again. He had the look of someone who has been rehearsing this and has now discovered that rehearsal doesn't help. Mara set down her coffee cup. Elias. I'm trying to say something, he said. I know, I'm going to say something first. She looked at him steadily, in the way she'd learned he could receive, directly, without softening it into something more comfortable than it was. I have thought about leaving. I want to be honest about that. In the first month, when Elsie was watching me like I was going to confirm everything she already believed about people who leave, I thought about it. She paused. And in the weeks after the fire, when my shoulder hurt and the barn was ash and the legal case was still uncertain, I thought about it again. He was very still. And I didn't go, she said. Not because of the crisis. Not because you needed the help, though you did. I stayed because somewhere in the middle of all of it, this stopped being a job I was doing and became a place I was in. Those are different things. She held his gaze. I'm not staying because I don't have anywhere else to go. I have other options, though they're not glamorous ones. I'm staying because I don't want to leave. That's a different reason, and I think you should know the difference. Elias looked at her for a long moment. I love you, he said. He said it the way he said things he meant, flat and direct and without any decorative approach, like he'd cut straight to the center of it because everything around the center was just distance. I don't know when it happened exactly. I know that's not a satisfying answer, but I know it's true. And I know I've been trying to figure out how to say it for long enough that it was starting to become its own kind of problem. Mara felt something shift in her chest. Not a surprise exactly, but the arrival of something she'd been aware was coming and had not let herself look at directly. She had learned to be careful with her own feelings, the way you're careful with things that have been broken once. Not closed off from them, just careful. I know, she said quietly. You knew, he said. I suspected. She looked at him. I've been careful, she said. I'm a widow who took a job in someone's house. I was careful not to assume or to reach for something that wasn't being offered. It's being offered, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was very still, and the east window was doing its October thing with the light, and outside she could hear the first sounds of the valley waking up. The horses, a distant call from one of the Delacroix properties, the ordinary morning sounds of a place where people lived and worked and kept going. I know, she said again. And this time it meant something different than the first time. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. They stayed like that for a moment. Two people who had come through a great deal together and were now sitting at a kitchen table in the early morning light, and the ordinariness of the moment was exactly right. It was Toby who broke it, appearing in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt with Buck under his arm, and his hair in the particular configuration it achieved after sleep, which was somewhere between interesting and catastrophic. He looked at his father's hand over Mara's hand. He looked at both of their faces. His expression did the thing it had started doing more frequently, that rapid, unsentimental assessment of a 4-year-old who takes the world seriously. Can Mara be our mother? He asked. The question landed in the room with the clean, undeflectable force of a child who has not yet learned to be indirect about the things he wants. Elias looked at Mara. Mara looked at Toby. That's not a question I can answer for Mara, Elias said, with a care that told Mara he'd understood exactly what needed to be said. Toby turned the full weight of his serious gaze on her. Mara thought, in the space of that moment, about what the word meant. Not the legal definition, not the social one, the actual meaning of it, stripped back to what it required and what it gave. She thought about Elsie saying Mama showed me about the warped window latch, and the way she'd said it, not as grief exactly, but as inheritance. The thing a mother passes to a daughter is not replaceable. Nobody was pretending otherwise. But a family is not a fixed thing with a fixed number of people in it. It can grow in different directions than the ones it started in, and that growth doesn't erase what came before. It grows around it, the same way she told Caleb grief works. You don't get smaller, you get bigger. The original thing stays, it just takes up a different proportion. She looked at Toby with his catastrophic hair and his wooden horse and his enormous, serious eyes. Yes, she said. Toby looked at Buck, then back at her. He nodded, apparently having confirmed something with the horse, and found the response satisfactory, and walked to the kitchen table and climbed into his chair. I want eggs, he announced. Elias made a sound. It was the laugh. The full one. Finally, not the almost version she'd been hearing for months, but the actual thing. It was not a loud laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has been surprised by something good in a moment when he wasn't protecting himself against it. Mara stood up and got the eggs. Elsie came down 20 minutes later and found her father at the table looking different than he had looked in a very long time. Not lighter, exactly, because he was a heavy-natured man and always would be, but open in a way he generally wasn't. She looked at him and then at Mara at the stove, and she did the calculation that 13-year-olds do in an instant, drawing conclusions from information that nobody has given them directly. She sat down. She poured herself coffee from the pot. She'd started drinking it in September, weak and with a great deal of sugar, which Mara had not commented on because picking your battles meant leaving some battles entirely alone. Okay, Elsie said, to nobody in particular. That was Elsie's way. She had her mother's precision with the warped window latch and her father's economy with words, and the combination produced a girl who said exactly what she meant in the smallest number of syllables available. Okay covered a great deal of ground. Mara brought the eggs to the table and sat back down, and the morning proceeded in the way mornings do when they have been shaped by routine and are now also, quietly, shaped by something new layered underneath the routine like a changed foundation. The official findings came from the oversight body in the third week of November. Greer rode down from Cheyenne with the papers himself, which told Mara the news was significant enough to warrant the trip. He sat at the kitchen table, his usual chair, which had become, in the odd way of things, specifically his when he was visiting, and laid the report out and walked them through it. Tanner's conduct had been found to constitute improper professional conduct in 6 documented instances, 3 of which involved direct financial benefit from a party with active assessment interests. His pension was under review. He would not serve in public office again. The special assessment against the Rourke property was formally dismissed. The procedural irregularities in the assessment process were noted in the official record in language that made the source of those irregularities impossible to misread. The case against Crow himself was more complicated, as Greer had always said it would be. The Territorial Attorney's Office had opened an investigation into the fraudulent land acquisitions. It would take time, potentially another year, possibly longer. The shell company in Cheyenne had already begun dissolving its holdings, which Greer described as the behavior of people trying to minimize exposure, which was itself informative. He's not going to prison, Elias said. He said it flatly, without a question mark. I don't know that, Greer said carefully. The territorial investigation is serious. If the Garfield family's complaint gets traction, and if Cole Mercer's testimony holds, there's a real possibility of criminal fraud charges. He paused. But I'm not going to promise you something I can't guarantee. He's not going to prison, Elias said again. Still flat. Still without a question mark. Mara looked at him. She understood what he was doing. Not giving up, not dismissing the legal process, but building a version of the outcome he could live with that wasn't contingent on Crow being punished to the full extent of what he deserved. Because people who depend entirely on the justice system Getting everything exactly right tend to end up bitter, and Elias Rourke had enough bitterness in his past without adding more. What matters, Mara said, is that the ranch is yours. That's what he was trying to take, and he didn't get it. Elias looked at her. Yes, he said, that's what matters. Greer stayed for supper, which had become the tradition when he visited. June made a beef stew with the focused authority she'd developed in the kitchen, and Noah set the table with the specific attention to detail he brought to arrangements. Everything even, everything deliberate, a visual neatness that contrasted with the charcoal still perpetually on his left hand. Caleb sat beside Pierre Delacroix, who had become a regular presence at the Rourke table, and they talked about the barn's hayloft configuration with an expertise that made Greer glance at Mara with a small expression of amusement. Toby ate his stew and informed the table that Buck had decided he liked November better than September. Why's that? Pierre asked with complete seriousness. Quieter, Toby said. Nobody could argue with that. After supper, while Greer was reviewing some final paperwork with Elias in the front room, and the twins were doing something loud upstairs that was probably supposed to be quiet, Mara stood at the kitchen window washing the last of the dishes, and Elsie came to stand beside her and picked up a dish towel and started drying without being asked. They worked in silence for a while, which was its own kind of conversation with Elsie. Are you going to marry him? Elsie asked. Mara handed her a bowl. We haven't talked about it in those terms yet, she said, but you're going to. Probably, Mara said. Elsie dried the bowl with the thoroughness she applied to everything. I don't need you to be my mother, she said. I had a mother. I know, Mara said, but Elsie stopped. She was working on something, the same way she worked on a stuck window latch, finding the right angle. You're already here, she said finally, and you already know how we are. The bad parts, too. She glanced at Mara sideways. Most people who knew only the bad parts would have left. Most people, Mara agreed. Elsie set the bowl on the shelf. I'm glad you didn't, she said. She said it quickly, with the precise efficiency of someone who has decided to say a hard thing before they can decide not to. And then she picked up the next dish, and the subject was closed, and they went back to the dishes, and the closed subject sat between them warmly, which was better than if it had stayed open. Caleb found her the following morning in the barn, where she'd gone to check on Murphy, who had been opinionated about the cold weather in a way that expressed itself as an unwillingness to eat in the morning. Caleb leaned against the stall door and watched her with Murphy for a while, and then he said, Dad told us this morning about, he gestured vaguely, you and him. What did you think? Mara asked. Caleb looked at Murphy. I think he's been different since you came, he said. Better different. He talks more. He asks us things instead of just telling us. He paused. He looked at us before, but it was like he was looking from far away, like there was glass between him and us. He stopped again. I don't know how to explain it. You explained it fine, Mara said. He looked at her. He was 12 now. He'd had a birthday in October, which they'd celebrated with June's cake and a level of decoration that May had organized to the limits of what was available in Iron Hollow Valley, which turned out to be more than you'd think. He was growing in the way boys do at that age, in irregular increments, in height, and also in the quality of his thought, which was becoming something more than a child's. I'm glad you stayed, he said. He said it the same way Elsie had said it, quickly, before the opportunity closed. These Rourke children had learned something about saying the important things while they could. Me too, Mara said. Murphy took this moment to accept her offering of oats, which he'd been resisting for 20 minutes. With the condescending air of a horse conceding a point without admitting he was wrong. Noah's contribution came not in words, but in the way his contributions always came. He left a drawing on Mara's pillow one evening, not on the table, not tucked under a cup, but on her pillow specifically, so she would find it last thing. It was the full family at the kitchen table, the bird's-eye view she recognized from the drawing at the hearing supper, but larger and more detailed and with changes. The figures were clearer than before. Toby had Buck on the table. May's braid was losing its fight. June's apron had a flower print on the front. Caleb sat straight, which was new. The earlier drawing had him slightly hunched. Elias's hat was still on the peg, but in this version there was something in the quality of his figure's posture that was different, more present, less like a person managing distance. And Mara's figure at the end of the table, under it, in Noah's small, careful handwriting, he had written one word: Mom. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time with that drawing in her hands, and she let herself feel it fully, without the carefulness she usually maintained. The whole of what had happened since a Tuesday in July, when she'd stepped off a supply wagon with a broken suitcase, and no particular plan beyond the next meal. She felt the grief still in it, because Thomas had been real, and the life they'd had was real, and the loss of it had been real, and none of that became less true because something good had come after. She felt the relief of the legal fight being finished. She felt the particular kind of tiredness that lives on the other side of sustained effort. The tiredness that isn't bad, but is absolute. And she felt, sitting with Noah's drawing and the sounds of the house settling around her, a thing she hadn't felt since before Missouri started going wrong. At home. Not the performance of it, or the maintenance of it, or the aspiration toward it. The actual feeling, the particular groundedness of being in a place that knows you back. She put the drawing in the drawer beside the others and lay down and let the house talk itself to sleep around her. They were married in May, under the old cottonwood tree at the east edge of the Rourke property, because the cottonwood had been there longer than anything else on the land, and Elias had proposed it with a matter-of-factness that suggested he'd been thinking about it for longer than he was going to admit. The county clerk, a small, efficient woman named Mrs. Adler, who had once told Mara quietly that the dismissal of the Rourke assessment was the best news she'd heard from that office in 3 years, conducted the ceremony with the brisk practicality of someone who understood that the occasion didn't need embellishment. The valley came. Not just the ranchers who had stood together through the fall, though they were all there, Warren and Clara Holt, Ruth Connolly, in a dress she'd clearly kept for important things, Henri Delacroix, and Pierre, the Pearson family. The young ranchers from the ridge, Cole Mercer standing at the edge of the gathering with the slightly uncertain presence of a man who was not entirely sure he belonged, but had been told he was welcome. They came, most of Iron Hollow Valley, and they stood under the cottonwood in the May afternoon and watched Elias Rourke and Mara Bennett become something that didn't have a precise name yet, but that everyone present understood. Elsie stood beside Mara, not as a flower girl or a small ceremony participant, but as herself. Elsie Rourke, at 13, in her good dress with her hair actually pinned up for once, standing beside the woman who was about to become her father's wife, with the steady, clear-eyed presence of a girl who had made her peace with something and was now simply present for it. When Mrs. Adler asked if anyone present wished to speak, Elsie said nothing. She reached over and took Mara's hand and held it, briefly, and let it go. It was the most Elsie-like thing she could have done, and it was more than enough. Caleb stood with his father and didn't say anything, which was correct. But when it was done, and the small gathered crowd began to move toward the tables, June and May had spent 2 days arranging with a competitive intensity that had produced a genuinely impressive spread. Caleb found Mara and said simply, "Welcome to the family, officially," and then walked away before the moment could become one he'd have to manage. May cried. She was not a crier by nature, which made it more surprising, and she was furious at herself for it, which made the tears come faster, which made June laugh at her, which made May furious at June, which resulted in a brief but energetic argument that broke down into helpless laughter so quickly that nobody watching could quite follow the transition. This was May and June being exactly May and June, which was its own kind of gift. Noah gave Mara a drawing at the reception. He had been working on it for weeks. She could see the accumulated care in it, the cleanness of the lines, the detail in every face. It was the cottonwood tree with figures beneath it, the ceremony itself, rendered from memory before it happened based on his sense of how it would look, and it was almost exactly right. In the lower corner, he had signed it with his name, the first time he'd ever signed a drawing. She held it and looked at him, and he looked back with the characteristic combination of directness and uncertainty that was Noah's face when he'd done something significant and wasn't sure how it would land. "It's perfect," she said. He nodded. He looked like he might say something. Then he went to get food because he was 8 and the moment had reached its natural limit, and the food was genuinely good. And then there was Toby. He found her in the middle of the afternoon, when the reception had reached that loose, comfortable stage where people were sitting in the sun and talking, and the formality had evaporated. He came through the gathered people with the directness of a child on a specific mission, and he stopped in front of her with Buck held out at arm's length, the wooden horse presented flatly on his two small palms. "Buck says you're ours now," he said. Mara looked at the horse. She looked at Toby's face, the serious eyes, the undecorated sincerity of a child who means exactly what he says because he hasn't yet learned the other option. She took Buck very carefully in both hands. She held him close for a moment, and Toby watched her do it with something that looked close to satisfaction. "Can I keep him for a while?" Mara asked. Toby considered this. "He might want to come back sometimes," he said. "That's fine," Mara said. "He knows where we live." Toby nodded, accepting this arrangement as complete, and went to find Pierre Delacroix, who had been promising him a shoulder ride for the better part of an hour and was going to be held to it. Elias found her a few minutes later, standing at the edge of the cottonwood shade with Buck in her hands. He looked at the horse and then at her face, and she knew that he'd seen, because Elias missed almost nothing when it came to his children. He put his arm around her shoulders, simply, without announcement, the way he did physical affection now, the same way he said important things, without approach or apology. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She looked at the valley, at the gathered people in the May afternoon, at the house behind them, at the new barn standing clean and pale in the distance, at the mountains. "I'm really all right." He looked where she was looking. "The territorial investigation is still going," he said. "Could be another year before there's any resolution on Crow." "I know." "Greer says he's left the valley, settled somewhere east, sold the remaining properties he still owned outright." "Good," Mara said. "It's not justice, exactly." "No," she agreed. "It's not exactly justice. But the Garfield family got their land back last month. The Connolly place is intact. The Valley ranches are intact." She paused. "He came here to take everything, and he left with less than he started. That's something." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that I was protecting my children by not falling apart in front of them, by being solid, by managing everything alone." "I know," Mara said. "I wasn't protecting them," he said. "I was just alone. And so were they. We were all alone in the same house." She said nothing, because it was true, and he knew it, and he didn't need her to confirm it. "You showed me that," he said, "without making a thing of it. You just—" He made the gesture she'd seen him make before, the one that meant the thing he was trying to describe was larger than the available language. "You were just here, and you kept being here, and eventually I figured it out." Mara looked at the wooden horse in her hands. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a supply wagon in Iron Hollow Valley with $14 and a broken suitcase and no plan beyond the next practical thing. She thought about the courage it had taken. Not the dramatic kind, not the running into burning barns kind, though that had been real too, but the quieter and more sustained kind. The courage of getting up in a stranger's house and making breakfast and staying through the hard parts and deciding again, every day, without any guarantee that it would work out, to remain. That kind of courage doesn't get sung about. It doesn't make the sort of story that becomes a legend. It is the kind that holds things together from the inside, that works at the level of daily life where most of life actually happens. And it is the kind that is most easily overlooked precisely because the people who practice it are too busy doing it to ask for acknowledgement. But there are places, valleys, families, lives that exist because someone chose that particular kind of courage. Someone showed up. Someone stayed. Someone kept making the next practical thing happen until the next practical thing became something larger, and the something larger became something that couldn't have existed without them. Mara had not come to Iron Hollow Valley to save anyone. She had come because she needed work. The saving, if that was the right word, and she was not sure it was, had happened in both directions and over time, and without any dramatic declaration of intent. That was the truth of it. You do not decide to build a family. You decide over and over again to stay. And at some point the staying has been long enough and deep enough that the family is simply a fact. And the deciding continues, but it no longer feels like a choice you're making under uncertainty. It feels like coming home. Years later, when people in Iron Hollow Valley told the story, and they did tell it, the way people tell the stories of things that happened to their valley and shaped it, they told it in pieces. The fire. The hearing. The way the ranchers had stood together when Crow expected them to fall separately. The documents that brought down an assessor who'd thought himself untouchable. But the piece they told most often, and the one that stuck, was the woman with the broken suitcase. She hadn't arrived with money or influence or a plan. She hadn't conquered the frontier with a weapon or a legal decree or a fortune. She had arrived with competence and patience and the kind of intelligence that presents itself as common sense. And she had looked at a broken family and a threatened valley and decided, without drama, that these were things worth staying for. A widow from Missouri who needed a job, who made soup on her first day and stayed for the rest of her life. The children she had not given birth to became the children she raised. The man who had been fighting alone learned, slowly and imperfectly, and not without difficulty, to let someone stand beside him. The valley that had been picked apart by a man who understood isolation as a weapon learned to understand itself as a community. None of it was clean. None of it was without cost. Elsie carried her mother's memory for her whole life, and there were days when it was a wound and days when it was a comfort and days when it was both at the same time, and Mara never tried to sort those days out for her. Caleb learned to ask for help with the particular difficulty of someone who has spent years believing that asking is weakness, and he kept learning it, and it kept being hard. May and June remained a force of nature, which was both a trial and a gift depending on the day. Noah became a surveyor, which surprised no one who had watched him map the valley on a kitchen wall at age 8. Toby grew up and became a rancher, which also surprised no one, and he kept Buck on his windowsill his entire life. And when people asked about the wooden horse, he told them it had belonged to his mother. Not his first mother or his second mother, just his mother. Because that was what she was. What Mara understood, in the years that followed, was something she could not have articulated when she stepped off that wagon in Iron Hollow Valley with no plan and $14 and a latch held shut with a leather strip. She understood it later, the way you understand most true things. In retrospect, looking back from enough distance to see the shape of it. That the hardest things are not usually the dramatic ones. The fire was terrifying and real, and she would carry the scar on her shoulder her whole life, the faint mark of a beam in a burning barn. But harder than that had been the daily decision to be present in a house full of grief, to not flinch from the difficulty of it, to keep showing up on the bad days as reliably as on the good ones. That families are not born. They are built, badly and slowly, with arguments and miscommunications and days when everyone is at their worst, and the building is the point. The imperfect building is the point. That the people who change things are not always the ones with the power or the position or the plan. Sometimes they are the ones who simply refuse to leave. Under the cottonwood tree in May, with the valley gathered around her and Elias's arm across her shoulders, and Buck safe in her hands, Mara Bennett, Mara Rourke. Now, though she would keep both names because she had been both women and both mattered, looked at what had been built in Iron Hollow Valley and felt the simple, undecorated truth of it. She had come looking for a job. She had found, instead, what it felt like to be necessary, not in the way of someone who is used and then set aside, in the way of someone who is woven in, whose presence has become part of the fabric of something, so that the thing would be genuinely and permanently different without them. That was enough. More than enough. Toby's voice reached her from across the reception, where he had finally gotten his shoulder ride from Pierre and was now surveying the gathered valley from that height with the expression of a 5-year-old who has achieved an optimal vantage point. "Mara," he called, "I can see the barn from here." "Good," she called back. "It's big," he said, with satisfaction. "It is," she said. She kept Buck close and stayed in the May afternoon and let the sounds of Iron Hollow Valley, her valley now, her people, her noise, settle around her like something she had always been moving toward.